Snow moved like the breath of a great beast over the battlements of Winterfell. A fine white veil caught and torn upon every black tooth of stone. The wind worried the shutters and slid through any crack it could find, testing the old castle with cold fingers, and the castle answered with quiet groans, the mutter of banners, the faint rattle of chain on hook. Jon stood on the parapet above the inner ward and watched the flakes take the light of the torches and become a storm of little embers before they sank to ash on the stones. Ghost's fur had caught a dusting along his back and ears. The dire wolf pressed his pale muzzle into Jon's hand and breathed out in a soft huff, as if to remind him there was warmth in the world yet. He should have been Abed. The hall below held the banked remains of a great fire and a dozen men sleeping where they had fallen after meat and ale, boots still on, mouths open to the rafters. The kitchens had gone quiet hours ago. The north did not sleep entire. There were always grooms to coax one more flake of ice from a horse's hoof, old women muttering prayers at the weirwood's face in the godswood, boys with red hands breaking ice crust off the well. But the castle had settled into its winter breathing, slow and heavy, each snore and creak a wheeze of an old giant. Beyond the walls, the world was black and white. Black for the trees ringing the godswood, black for the road, black for every gap where snow did not cling. White for the roofs, white for the drifts, white for the long fields stretching to the river like length upon length of linen laid out to dry. The moon hung low and round and unkind as a coin. Jon pulled his cloak tighter around him and closed his gloved fingers on Ghost's ruff until he felt the steady animal life beneath the fur. In the stillness, his mind made paths it ought not to take. He heard a woman's laughter he would never hear again. He saw a wildling village on a shale shore with smoke rising thin as thread and then snuffed out by the wind. He smelled the cold, raw tang of the sea at Hardhome, and with it the stink of fear. He saw dead eyes, and a man with skin paler than snow and irises like shattered glass. The memory was a scar under a sleeve. He avoided scratching it. It itched all the more. Ghost's ears pricked. Jon felt the wolf's attention go to the air as a man feels the turn of his own head. Somewhere below, a shutter banged once and then again. A raven's silhouette cut across the face of the moon like a thrown knife. It came wheeling toward him on the wind, fast and certain, and landed on the crenel beside him without so much as a flutter to spare. His beak clicked in the light. "Back to your loft," Jon told it, more to himself than the bird because talk eased something tight. The raven tilted and showed a bead of frost on its nostril. It had flown far and hard. He reached to settle its feathers, and Ghost stiffened so suddenly the glove tightened at Jon's wrist. The raven's eyes filmed over, cloud milky inside glass, and Jon's hand froze in the air. The bird opened its beak. The sound that came out was not a croak. "Jon," the raven said, and it was a boy's voice, thinned as if spoken from underwater, stretched and hurt and patient. Jon. His name fell into him like a stone falling into a well that had no bottom. The wind hissed along the wall, and the torches flamed and guttered, and the raven's sightless eyes turned toward him. Jon had heard his name as a curse and a plea. The sound of it now was neither. "Bran," he said, because there was a way the voice touched the edges of old things. Wet leaves, scraped knees, the smell of Maester Luwin's herbs. He had not seen his brother since the world had turned and left a boy behind. He had imagined 100 meetings. None of them had included a bird's mouth. "Listen," said the raven. It was not a request. Ghost pressed against Jon's legs so hard his knees locked. Jon took the rough cap of stone for steadiness. The raven's beak parted further, and with the next word the world seemed to slip. He was looking at Winterfell from Winterfell, but a veil had been pulled over his eyes, and through a seam in that veil light leaked, the thin light of a far place. "North," said the voice, and the parapet went away. White emptiness spread without end. The horizon was not a line but a smear. Snow blew horizontal, and the sky was made of old wool. The only color was a bruised purple shimmer low where land met sky. No, not land. Ice and sea swapping places. In that world men were as nothing, but something moved, immense and patient. It moved the way a tide moves. Jon saw it without seeing its edges. Ranks upon ranks of dead whose breath made no clouds, their armor rhymed, their faces emptied of anything but purpose. He felt the hairs lift at the nape of his neck. That rising made a noise like a far mill wheel. In its heart walked a figure riding something that might have been a horse once. He had no color at all. He was the color that comes when fires have died. The land threw the sound of hooves back to Jon through long halls of snow and ice. A wind of glass went through him. When the wall came into view, it was flanked by sea, and at its foot the water was not open but stopped by a scurf of ice that grew like a disease. The ice ran its teeth along Eastwatch's stones. Far out, black water heaved sluggishly, and a distant breaking carried ashore like a cough. On that black water a few points of orange moved. Torches, men, too few, and under all of it there was a pull, a sense of some intention reaching ahead of itself, testing, prodding, not like a man testing a gate for a weak hinge but like a blind creature learning a room with its hands. The raven's voice came and went inside it all. They go to the sea. He wants a door. Eastwatch will be tested first. Not only the walls of stone fall. Wards have roots as trees do. He finds them. Jon drew breath and tasted cold metal. He shut his eyes to shut out what he saw, and the seeing stayed. "Bran," he said. His own voice sounded small and breathy, as though spoken through linen. "Where are you?" "How?" "You must move them," said the boy who was his brother and not a boy. "Move the people, not kings and lords alone. I'll get them south. The gift is a graveyard if you leave them there. The rivers will stop. The snow will keep falling. They are walking now." "Now," Jon said. The word balked in his mouth. "How far, how fast? Who goes to Eastwatch?" "Tormund." "Your friends," said the raven, as if those names were pieces on a board far away that could be put anywhere a hand chose. "They are brave and human. They must be more than that. Dragonglass, all you can find, and oil and siege arrows and lines of fire. Salt, bone, rope. Do not waste what lives you can keep." He saw. He did not want to, but the sight had him. The blue-white flare that was the Night King turned his head as if someone had spoken to him over his shoulder. That turning was a simple, terrible thing, like watching a cliff decide to fall. When his gaze slid across the white, there were faint swirls drawn in old snow like the marks of a child's finger. The figure looked down at those marks, and what Jon felt then was not fear so much as a recognition of pattern. A man could learn a thing by repetition. A thing could be made that way to fit. The cold pressed into his teeth. He clenched them. The raven's film blew away from its eyes. It staggered once on the parapet stone and croaked like a common bird. Jon put out his hand to catch it and set it to his forearm. Ghost let the tips of his teeth show, then suppressed them, uneasy in his own way. The wind cut at them all and could not get through. "Bran," Jon said again into the cold, because there was warmth in making the sound, and because the shape of his brother's name had always been a kind of shelter. "Can you hear me?" There was only the bird now, and the wind, and the castle's slow breath. The raven cocked its head and dug its claws a little. Jon waited. No more words came. Men do not put their ears to snow, but if he had, he would have heard something stirring far to the north where no living thing had business moving. When he came down into the hall, he had to walk around a tangle of humanity. A boy with straw in his hair had fallen asleep against a bench with a trencher still on his lap. A black dog of small size had wedged itself between two men and snored like a much bigger animal. One of the tables was half set with plates from earlier and had a thin coat of flour over it from someone's hands. Everything in him that had been made soft by home and heat hardened into a tool. He pushed the vision away from where it bit at him and locked it behind his eyes for a little while. He would take it out again where it could do work. Davos sat on a stool with his back to the fire as if to dry out bones that had taken on damp. The heat had painted one side of his face pink. He opened his eyes when Jon came near and blinked as if to clear ash that was not there. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, and hauled himself as straight as he could with the stiffness winter lays on old wounds. Jon crouched, made a wall with his body against the draft that slid under the door. "There was a raven," he said. Not from any maester-eyed name. He glanced up. The great hall took in the glance and swallowed it. Bran, the boy, Davos said at once, as if he kept a list of Stark names in his head and ticked them off when the world killed one and added another if a miracle happened. Your brother who went north with the wildling girl and the big fellow and the reed girl? The one who… Well, there were tales. Hotter. That one. Jon nodded. The wordless ache of that name passed through the hall and out again like a draft that would not settle. It was him, not himself, but him. He told Davos what he had seen without salt on it, as plain as he could make anything so strange plain. Davos did not make jests or look up to the rafters as if to ask the stranger's permission to leave the room. He listened. The lines around his mouth deepened into tools of their own. I took a fishwife in White Harbor once to see a witch about her baby, he said when Jon had done. The witch burned dried eel and thyme on a brazier and told her what the baby's life would be like. The fishwife nodded and paid and went home and did what she would have done anyway. Men like me were used to smoke and predictions. But this is not that. The boys proved he can look so far the world turns under him. If he says the dead are at the sea, I'll wager my few fingers on the truth. Eastwatch can't be left by itself, and the gift must be emptied. Sansa will say the same, Jon said. But there are the lords. Davos made a face at lords that was not unkind. He rubbed his hands once, blew into them, and stopped, as if jotting a figure in chalk in his head. We will tell them the thing a lord of the north should be told in such a winter. Not what they want, what is. The snows know no kings. They'll swear and call you crow and boy and traitor and fool. Some of them. If there's a road south that does not end in graves, it begins with getting the children and the old out of the gift. And Eastwatch, Jon said, remembering the black water and those faint orange eyes moving on it. Tormund and Ed. We send word to Castle Black now. If even half of what I saw, I'll rouse a few men who can write in a cold, Davos said, already making to rise. And that girl of yours, one with the quick hands and quicker tongue, the steward. She can wake Maester Wolkan while I wake the ink pots. We'll have a flock of birds off the rookery before the moon goes down. Thank you, Jon said, because it was always good to say it to a man who had to move through cold on your say-so. And because Davos had the air of a man whose bones had had enough of debt and yet kept paying. Ghost followed him like light over snow as he climbed to the Maester's tower. Wolkan had not been Abed. He had the peculiar look men got in winter on the far side of too many hours at a table. Eyes overbright, a little bit of ink at the corner of his mouth, a wool cap pulled down so hard his eyebrows had to make a choice to stay under it or stick out. My lord, he said, and then corrected himself with a wince. Your grace. For the habit of old titles is stubborn in the north. Is it Eastwatch? I had a dream the brazier went out in the rookery and all the birds were blocks of ice. Then we'd better get them in the air before your dream comes true, Jon said. He dictated the first letter. To Lord Commander Edison Tollett, Castle Black. Reinforce Eastwatch with all speed. Tormund Giantsbane's folk to go there as well, with all the men who can string a bow. Expect pressure along the sea ice. Prepare lines of oil and fire. Set dragonglass arrowheads and spears if you have them, and if you do not have them, we will send them. Hold, but do not die in place. Falling back is not defeat if it keeps men alive to kill whites tomorrow. There was more practical matters. Stock of lamp oil, carts, number of mules. He heard his own voice and felt the odd split that comes when a man leads. The man speaking is made of the same meat as the man hearing, but one of them is harder and older. By dawn, the rookery was a storm of wings. Men went with their cheeks red and their fingers wrapped in cloth up the narrow stairs with leather tubes under their arms. Sansa met him on the way down with her hair plaited and her mouth set. She had put on a gown that would have looked too fine for the keep a year ago. Now it seemed right, as if Winterfell itself needed banners and braided hair and fur-trimmed sleeves to be brave. They walked together as if they had practiced it to the hall where the lords would sit and shout. Your brother? She asked as they turned a corner together, and a draft found them and played with her hair like cold fingers. What did he show you? He told her while they walked. Sansa listened with the skill of someone who has learned that what is said and what is unsaid are tools, and that the order in which things are said is a tool as well. When he finished, she took a breath and nodded. "Then we begin with the people," she said, as if she had hoped for a different answer and had not let that hope write itself on her face. The hall was a different place by morning. A long line of smoke ran along the rafters like a river stranded overhead. The benches were full of fur and steel and the smells that came with both. Men spoke in voices meant to go across rooms. They turned when Jon and Sansa entered and made the noise of respect you make for a king you are not sure you would follow to death but will follow to breakfast. Davos was already near the dais with a bowl of porridge cooling under his nose, as if he would trick fate into letting him eat by pretending he had already eaten. Jon did not speak as a boy who had once been a steward too ordinary to sit at the high table. He did not speak as a boy at all. The words came clean and without decoration. He told them of the dead walking south along the sea ice and of Eastwatch and of the gift. He did not say the Night King. He had learned names can gallop away with a room. He said we cannot hold the north if we fill the barrows with children. We cannot hold anything without men. Empty the gift. Everyone south across the long lake, the King's Road, down to the Bar Rollins. Get them in from the scattered steads. Pack White Harbor's granaries until the grain pushes the door open. "Aye, and who fills those granaries?" asked the Lord of the Pipers. No, not pipers, that was the Riverlands. This was a manderly man with a brow like a shelf. "We will have men in the fields and men behind walls and men on roads. The fields that are not under snow now will be under snow in a fortnight. How do you defend the north once you abandon half of it?" "By having living men behind a line we can supply," Jon said before the shouting had a chance to find its legs. "The dead will walk anywhere the cold walks. They do not eat. They do not drink. We hurt them with fire and dragonglass. We bleed to feed our fires. I will not feed them our sons because we wanted to keep farmhouses standing in a place we cannot hold in winter." "A man says we cannot hold," said a lean horn-voiced lord whose name Jon could not pull up, "because you cannot hold all names in your head when the room itself has a name it will not speak. A man says he will not. That is one man's mouth. The north is full of men. The Umbers, the Karstarks." His eyes went to Sansa and away. It was not a kindness. Sansa stood before Jon could. "House Stark has recalled its banners," she said, her voice smooth as shears. "The Umbers and Karstarks have bent the knee and put their houses in order. They will send men. They will also do as their liege lords say when their liege lords command. The question is not whether we prefer to die in our fields or on our roads. The question is whether we keep living men behind our walls long enough to fight when there is fighting to be done. Do you disagree that living men fight better than old bones?" A laugh flickered here and there, small as sparks. Smiles show teeth, and teeth are only bones turned outward, but it is a different thing to show them for humor rather than for hunger. The lean lord lifted a palm. "No woman's tongue will shame me into stubbornness," he said with a tight curve at the corners of his mouth. "My men will move our folk south." Others bent and unbent. There were quarrels about carts and whose horses would be taken and whether White Harbor could be trusted to feed men it did not know, and if the seas would freeze all the way or only part way, whether seals would swim under ice as men said, and if children could be taught to dig clams in winter with numb fingers. Jon let it go on just long enough that the room heated itself with its own noise, then cut it with his hand, a straight slice. He named men to clear the steadings, men to ride with horns and call folk into the village greens, men to go with rope and sledges. He named Davos to count salt and oil, and Sansa to count blankets and boots because she would do it as she did everything, with numbers that made other people's feelings a separate matter. He named himself to go to Castle Black with 150 riders and the wildlings who would come, to put his hand on Eastwatch and find out if the sea had teeth he had not seen yet. Later, by the fire, with the room emptied of its argument, Sansa laid her palm on the map of the north and dragged a finger from the wall to the long lake to White Harbor. "We can make a line here," she said, as if the map were a piece of cloth and she would cut and hem it. "We cannot cover every deer path and frozen brook. But the hills and the King's Road and the river will force them. When you go north, You must not let yourself be made a hero beyond use. You sound like father, Jon said, and smiled despite the taste of iron that thought had taken on these last years. And like mother, though I only remember her from the way anyone remembers a thing they never had. I sound like a person who has studied what happens when men run toward swords, she said. After a beat, her mouth softened. Bran will come home soon. Will he? Jon asked, and did not say I saw, I heard, I felt. Some things want to be worn close to the skin until you learn what they are for. He left Winterfell with the sun a pale pearl low in the east and the world the color of pewter. The Vale men on their tall horses clinked and jingled like good workmen carrying every tool they might need. A sound Jon had not yet learned to love. The wildlings had no such noise. They rode in furs and silence and smoke. They had brought axes with blades as black as the smudge left by a child's thumb. Tormund rode with them, his beard a frostbush, his laugh a thing that could heat a little circle of air and then be gone. At East Watch, he said around the edge of a strip of dried meat, there's a man who can ruin good ale with his talk, but he never drank all that much anyway. He'll hold. He should not die for East Watch, Jon said. He should live for the North. That's a pretty thing to say for a man who died and came back, Tormund said, and then softened it with a shove of his shoulder like a father nudging a sulking son. We will put the dead back in the ground and pile stones on them as the old men did when the world was young. They slept that night in a hall at Queen's Crown with the roof patched by too many hands. The wind tried the patches in every way and found all of them good enough. Jon lay wakeful between his cloak and the boards and listened to men breathe and the little scurry of some animal behind the wattle in the wall. He thought of hands. Bran's hands on a branch, small, red-knuckled. A hand closing around his heart in the dark when he had lain on cold planks with a wound like any other wound and yet not like any other. He had been a man of the watch. He had been a dead man. He had been a king because men wanted a king to point at and say, "We have a king." He wondered if becoming so many men had worn the edges of him and made him not fit neatly into any one shape. He slept then as a man sleeps when the road has wearied him to a simplicity that belongs more to animals than to kings. They came to Castle Black by midday 2 days after. It had not changed, though men had, because the wall makes its own laws. The black slab of it drank the light, and the wind came off it smelling of iron and old breath. Ed met them in the yard with snow in his eyebrows. "Your Grace," he said in a tone that did not sit right in his mouth, as if he were borrowing his sister's shoes. "I see that crown didn't come with more cloaks. You still look as if the wind had decided you personally offended it." "It holds a grudge," Jon said, "and it's winning." Ed let his mouth bend just enough to be counted as a smile. "We've stripped the woods round here like an old nag's ribs. If the boys piss, the steam freezes and hangs in the air like ghosts. I assume you are here to tell me not to die." "Not to die here," Jon said. "There is a difference." Ed took him to the top of the wall. The way up had not become steeper. It always took the same toll in breath and patience, and the same old panic came at the last when the cage swayed and left a man's belly behind. They stood on the wide white flat and looked east. The sea was a hard thing. The skin of it had been sewn to the land in a rough, crooked seam wherever wind and cold could bring the needle home. Far out, black water heaved where the stitch had not yet taken. On it, as in his seeing, moved a speck that was man-made, and it dragged a thread of smoke behind it to prove it. Perhaps a fishing boat from Hardhome. No, Hardhome was a grave. A whaler out of somewhere that had not yet learned it was a place that would die. Or it was nothing alive at all. The wind blurred the edges of things until names could not hold. "East Watch," Ed said, "has oil enough to burn a harbor. It has rope and salt and men who know how to knot both. It has crab pots because men always imagine there will be time to eat crabs while they fight. It has 20 barrels of dragonglass arrowheads because you told us we would need them, and because Tormund had a yard of it under a heap of skins in a place I'd rather not describe. It has men who can light a line of fire faster than a flea can bite. It does not have enough men to stand if what you say is coming comes. But it has men who know the meaning of stand and fall back and stand again. They went down and looked at the stores so that Jon could see with his hands and not only his eyes. He took a case of arrowheads in his palms. They were small, ugly, dull black. Every one of them could be a life. He set the case down. He slept a little in a narrow room that knew his shape, and in the morning he took 120 men to Eastwatch by the sea. Eastwatch smelled of tar, salt, cold and men dying and not yet dead, so of grief and stubbornness. The wall's arm that ran into the sea ended as all walls do, not with a clean stop, but with a bunching up, a ragged crouch. The gate was shut against the wind. Watchmen had their cloaks over their mouths and brows and left their eyes to the weather. When Jon passed, a few of them drew themselves a little taller, the way men do when someone they've decided is their own comes near. He had never called himself lord to these men, and they had never called him anything but brother. What they called him now was brother with their eyes, which is more than any crown makes. Tormund made a show of pissing over the parapet into the afternoon wind and swearing at it for freezing his prick, because men needed something lewd and easy to balance what was coming. Jon let him. Then he set men to string lines for oil, to coil rope where cold hands could find it in the dark, to make ready the piles of dragonglass arrows where a string of fire could touch them all at once. He had them take down the old harpoons and see if they still knew how to bite wood. He set boys whose hands shook from cold to carrying torches until their hands shook from heat instead, because a boy who is useful can be brave. The next day, a raven came in with its chest heaving as if it had a man's lungs. The men in the rookery unrolled the little strip of vellum with hands that had learned to behave old before their time. The Old Town hand was neat as a prayer. The boy who brought it to Jon's hand could not stop smiling because he knew he had carried a thing that might be important. Jon recognized the shape of Sam's letters, the way he made his tailed letters longer than they had any need to be, as if he were making ladders for ants. The letter said, "The isle is black stone and fire. The old books say dragonglass, all you can mine, lies under dragonstone like honey under comb. Come for it if you can." The word come had a blot where the pen had hesitated, a habit of Sam's when asking men to do risky things. The letter also said other things about scrolls and kings and mistakes and the behavior of lords like children, none of which mattered as much as the line Jon had already read twice. He closed his eyes and saw the thin glowing seam in the ice again and the little marks in the snow and the blue-white eyes turning toward them, and then he saw instead a black, volcanic island rising from a gray sea, and a memory of a woman whose hair moved like storm rack. There was no picture of her in Sam's letter, but memory is a kind of sight too. He wrote back that night, "We will send for the dragonglass. If you can send men who know how to mine salt and stone, send them. If you cannot send men, send books that tell men how to mine stone without burying themselves. If they must be stolen from maesters who do not think anyone will ever read them, steal them politely and bring them anyway." He sealed it with wax and a pressed stamp Sansa had given him that made a wolf's head where the wax cooled. Bran came on a day when the wind died lower than a man's shoulder. He did not come as a bird. He came in a sledge pulled by a shaggy little horse and guided by Mira Reed, whose hair had taken winter and worn it as if she had chosen it. Jon saw them from the steps of the hall and said his brother's name out loud because a name is a rope you throw to a drowning man, and because sometimes it is a rope you throw to yourself. Bran was thinner than he had any right to be and heavier in the eyes. Those eyes did not focus on any one thing, but on a range of things like the horizon. When Jon put his arms around him, Bran made a sound that was not a sob and not a laugh. It was the sound a bowstring makes when it lets go. They held each other until Ghost came and pushed his nose between them, jealous and gentle both. In the godswood, the heart tree stood with its coat of ice like a shawl and its red eyes wet. Bran sat beneath it with his blanket folded over his legs and his hands in his lap. Jon sat at his feet as he had done when he had been a smaller boy and Bran had been only a little smaller. The snow on the branches above them shook itself at some light wind that could not be felt on the ground and fell in a soft, constant sift. The air smelled of iron and sap. If you breathed shallow, you could forget how cold bit your lungs. If you breathed deep, it set its teeth. "What did I show you?" Bran asked without looking at him, as if it were a test to see what the same mind does when it sees by two lights. "The dead on the ice," Jon said. The sea. Eastwatch. You showed me they would come along the sea and push the wall where the wall is not only stone. Bran nodded once. There is a mark under everything. Words are not words a man says once and keeps forever. They are like the roots of trees, and the sea eats earth. Can they be made again? Jon asked. They can, Bran said, if the right person makes them and if the wound under them is not rotten already. The Night King touched me. Through me, he learned the smell of our walls. Jon felt the summer's shadow pass across the godswood as if it had been there until now. He will come to it as a hound goes to a haunch, he said. Yes, said Bran, but he is curious too. He loves patterns. He wishes to finish them. He will come where we think he will not as well because he wants to be the one who chooses. He waits at lakes that are not lakes. He watches ravens to learn which ones do not fly away. He does not sleep. He can afford to be patient. What do we do? Jon asked, and heard how plain it sounded, and that was right. The right things are plain. Not just one thing, Bran said. He closed his eyes and touched the roots of the heart tree with his fingertips. You have to put men where there are lines to draw. Fire on water where water eats at stone. Glass in hands that have never held anything sharper than a scythe. Men who will run when you tell them to run and turn when you tell them to turn like geese in a wedge. You have to learn how he thinks and do a thing he does not expect. The window in him is that he believes he has seen the end of the story. He loves endings. Jon thought of a lake that was not a lake. He thought of the way snow runs in spirals when the wind catches it, and the way men make spirals with dead bodies when they want to whisper something ugly to the living and think even God will overhear. He thought of a dragon that was not yet dead. He looked at Bran and found his brother's face. It was a boy's face, in truth, under the weight of something old. There was a small scar at one temple that Jon did not remember. The boy's hair had grown in wrong since someone had cut it badly on the road. He wanted very badly to brush it back with his hand and make that terrible weight stop for a moment. He did not. Sam says there is dragon glass under Dragonstone, he said, and saw the memory of a woman again as he spoke only because the word dragged her like a net drags fish you did not mean to catch. He wrote that we could take as much as we can carry if we can get it out. You will go, Bran said, and you will not go. Part of you will stay here. You have learned to be two things at once. Be three. He wanted to ask how. He did not. A man can carry only so many questions at a time, and the ones he had were heavy and sharp as glass. He rose and wrapped the blanket more tightly around Bran and watched Mira look at his brother with a weariness that had love folded inside it like meat inside a pie. He must be warm, Jon said. He knows how to be cold, Mira said, a little bleak and with no apology in it. He knows how to be everything, I think. The day after Bran's arrival, a howling started along the coast. It was not wolves. It was the sound of wind forced through strange throats. Came in pulses like a heart. Men on the watchtowers turned their heads as animals do, the ear moving before the eye. The sea grew a skin, and then another, and then the skins stuck to each other and the whole surface became a field of pale scales. The current that ran under it did not stop, and so the ice heaved and cracked and mended and broke again, like an old man trying to get out of a chair. At Eastwatch, Jon put men out along the parapets in short watches, so they would not go dull from cold, and made them walk even when they wished only to hunch and hide their noses in their cloaks. He had them carry dragonglass-tipped spears over their shoulders so they would forget to feel how wrong they felt in the hand. He had them light fire along the far face of the wall when the wind came right so that the heat would breathe through the stone and make a skin of warm on the inside. He made them eat hot broth and then made them walk. He spoke to them the way a man speaks to horses before a fight. Low and steady, the same words over and over, until they became true simply because they had been said so many times by someone who did not flinch when he said them. When the dead came close enough to see, they were not a wall. They were grains of pepper cast across snow. They did not hurry. They did not make noise. They did not spread out in a way that seemed clever. They spread out as men do when they are used to being told where to go and now have to decide for themselves. That was not to say there was no thought to them. The thought was in the shape of the ground under their feet. In the one place an old stream had cut a low path, and the way that path had been covered with a crust of ice and snow so that a man would not notice until he stepped and went through to his thighs. They came along the coast where the wall's old spells ran shallow. They were led by men who were not men and by things that had never been men. The wind played around their ankles and they ignored it. It is a strange thing to watch something that ought to be slowed by cold move as if the cold were the floor of a hall polished for dancing. "Arrows," Jon said, and the first volley turned the sky noisy. The dragonglass heads flew and the fletching whispered. He did not look to see where they struck. He listened for the sound they made when they hit bone or nothing or something that was both bone and nothing. Some of the dead fell and did not rise. Some fell and rose. Those that rose took the glass in their new flesh and carried it like men carry a wound they planned to show to someone out of pride rather than pain. Jon had lines of oil set where the ice was strong and where it was weak. He waited for men to reach those lines and then had them lit. The fire took with a hungry hiss and ran with its own mind until it met a place where the wind fought it. Fire is a thing that loves to go downwind. The dead did not burn as men burn when oil takes to their clothes. They burned without surprise. They burned and kept walking until their legs burned from under them and they fell and became heaps of meat and black blades. Then the heaps moved again because someone had to pick up the bones and carry them further, and there were always hands to do that, even if the hands were on a body that had been picked apart by crows. A thing bigger than a man ran along the ice, half-crouched. It moved with a grace that did not belong to the old stories of giants. It cleared the oil with a jump that bent it double and then straight, and when it landed the ice under it cracked like a pane that had stood a winter too long. "Rope," Jon said, and the men with rope did what men with rope do. They put it where it needed to be. The thing stumbled and went to one knee, and a line came up around its shin like a snake and bit hard. 20 men threw their weight back in a pull that made their boots bite and their backs sing. The thing had a jaw like a boat's prow and teeth like old iron. It reached for the rope as if it would pull the men in hand over hand and eat them like sausages. A dragonglass spear slid under its ribs to the place where a man's heart would be. It made no sound at all, and then it was only weight. Weight broke the ice. It went down. The rope burned through hands and left blisters. It sank into the cold black and was gone. Men stood panting and looking at the hole it had made as if there might be an answer down there if a man only looked long enough. There was only dark water and the rope floating up in a lazy loop. They fought all day in that way, not a battle so much as a test. The dead came on, paused, learned, came on again. Jon saved where he could save and counted where he had to count. He sent men back behind the second line when their fingers went stiff. He pulled boys from places where men should stand and put men there instead. He did not think about whether the men he put there were fathers of those boys. He thought about the line. He listened for the sound of something breaking that was not wood or bone. He listened for a note underneath the noise that would tell him the dead had decided to stop testing and start taking. That note did not come, not yet. At nightfall, the wind lay down. The sea under its skin made a noise like a great animal sleeping. Jon stood above the parapet with Ghost beside him and watched the place where the dead had stopped. They had not gone away. They had crouched under a piece of ground that made a little lip like a hill's jaw. They had no need to warm themselves or eat. They formed shapes you would not call camps in any language. They sat and did not rest. Their watch was more patient than any living watch. Bran's raven came again that night, and when it opened its mouth the voice was thinner, strung farther out. "He is hungry for a thing he bit once," it said. "He wants to finish the bite. He looks for the dragon." "The dragon is not here," Jon said aloud, and a man in the yard below looked up at the voice and then looked away again quickly, as men do when they think the wind might have spoken and decide the wind has more important things to do than speak. "Not yet," Bran's voice said with the steadiness of a man who knows very well what yet means. "He thinks endings are gifts men give him. Don't give him that." "What do I give him?" Jon asked, and he did not know if he was speaking to a bird or to the heart tree or to his own inside voice that had grown a brother's accent. "Time," Bran said, "and a shape he does not know, and a story he hates." The raven's eyes cleared. It shook itself, smaller than the sound of wings the world made when it turned. In the morning, the sky had become low and heavy as a lid on a pot that had simmered all night. The first flakes were not many. Men looked up at them as if they were messengers of a piece of news a man already knew and had hoped had changed while he slept. By afternoon, there was nothing to see beyond the line of the sea, and even the sea made itself modest and kept its voice down. The dead stayed where they had stopped. Eastwatch breathed, counting. Men told each other jokes about sheep that no one laughed at. A boy dropped a pot of oil and watched it spill into the snow and did not cry because his hands were too cold to move to his face. A wildling woman took the pot from him and cuffed him hard and then gave him her glove without comment. The boy put it on and found that his hand remembered it had fingers. That night, the wind changed to a long, steady draw from the north. The change had a taste. John lifted his head and tasted it. Tasted like old ash fr. A fire someone had forgotten had ever been lit. He remembered Bran saying he loves endings. He thought of an island of black stone in a southern sea and men with picks, and books open to drawings of braces and tunnels, and Davos's voice saying if we are very careful we might bury fewer of our own. He thought of Sansa counting blankets. He thought of the line drawn on the map with her finger and the way maps lie and are true both. He slept for a handful of moments in a chair and dreamed of deep water with a light far below it that he could not get to because he had become a creature meant for cold air. He woke with a line of drool at one corner of his mouth and wiped his sleeve across his face and did not feel shame. He went up to the wall and found Ed watching the white with a squint. "They look like sheep," Ed said. "If a man had a stomach for sheep without heads." "You always were a poet," John said. "I always was hungry," Ed said. "A man who is hungry thinks of sheep." He tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" John did not. Then he did. It was a long way off, so far the sound was more a suggestion than a sound. It might have been the horn that calls men to the hall when there is meat. It might have been something else. He felt the hairs crawl along his forearms again under wool and leather. Ghost made a small, high sound in his throat. Not a whine, not quite. When the horn came again, nearer, John felt it in the boards of the parapet through his boots. He looked to the east out of habit, and then to the west where nothing ever comes except weather, and then to the north with his eyes watering from the wind. The sound came from the north, of course. When it came the third time, men down in the yard turned their heads the way cattle do when they smell rain. Someone's voice, too high and too loud, called, "Horns," and a man cuffed him for saying a thing everyone could already hear. The dead rose. They rose without rush, the way men get up in the morning on a day that has no hurry in it. They came on. John wanted to say wait until they are on our lines, but his mouth said now. And the arrows went and the fire ran and the rope lay where it ought. And a boy who had dropped a pot of oil yesterday did not drop anything today. They set their arrows for the white places on the dead where there looked to be no bone. And if there was bone under, the arrow found a chink because arrows can find such things when an arm knows how to send them. A chunking sound came from the sea, a hollow thunk like a club on wet wood. Men looked that way against their orders because men always look at the thing that goes thunk. A shape like a low boat moved under the ice, and for a moment the ice above it flexed and went opaque, then cleared. There were things under the ice that were not fish pulling at ropes that were not ropes. John felt a cold that came from no wind. He thought, not for the first time, that if winter had a mind it would think so very slowly that a man could die and be born and be a man again before winter finished one thought. But there were quick things in winter too, like pain and fear and the way men's mouths move when they tell lies they think small enough to be forgiven. He had no time for any of that now. The fight that followed was not the last. It was not meant to be. It was a thing to make men learn and to make dead learn. Some of the things that tried to learn died and stayed dead where glass had gone right or fire had gone deep. Others did not. The lines bent and unbent like old men on a cold morning. And then the dead stopped again with that patience that is not human. They stopped and watched without eyes that saw in any way a living man understands and let the living men understand that they had been watched. By morning, the sea spoke again with a different voice, a rot under the skin of it, and a line of black water appeared where the ice had been broken and then froze again and then broken. Men who had slept with their boots on woke with their boots frozen on their feet and cursed and were grateful because boots frozen on feet is better than boots not on feet at all. Jon wrote to Sansa with a charcoal stub and told her that Eastwatch holds and that if she had found men enough to move the gift she must move them faster, and that men will die and we will not waste their dying, and that if there are boys with hands fit to work bellows and men with a notion of iron, set them to glass. He told her he loved her. He told her with the pen and with the way he pressed his name as if pressing it hard would keep the line between them taut. He sent men south with news you could not tie to a bird's leg. He told Ed to keep his altar jokes under his tongue because men need to hear their commander say simple true things in plain voices and forget that the last thing he said was meant to be funny. He slept for 3 breaths at a time and once for 50 heartbeats by count, and woke to find Ghost with his head on Jon's boot, breathing. He breathed in time with the wolf for another 50 and stood because standing is a thing men do even when sitting would be kinder. On the 3rd day, a ship's mast showed itself black against the broken white line and then knifed down a channel a man might have sworn was not there. It had made the channel for itself. The hull wore ice like armor. Icicles clung along its rails like teeth. It flew no flag Jon knew. The sailors who leapt from it had beards like iron shavings and voices hoarse enough to make the ravens turn their heads. They brought casks with them that smelled of pitch and clean salt and whale, and they brought stories in mouths that told them badly. They had seen men on a far shore walking where a path had never been and a great swirl of birds above a black island that should have had no birds this early in the year. They had seen a wave stop like a dog told to halt. They had seen nothing at all. Men's eyes see what fear lets them. Jon gave them coin and blankets and permission to say prayers to whatever god had the patience to listen to sailors, and set them back out with messages in barrels sealed against sea and ice. He sent one to White Harbor. He sent one south to a place whose name he did not put on paper because letters live longer than men. He sent one that said, "If you have dragons, do not throw them away. If you do not pretend you do." The wind climbed again toward evening, and with it something else. Jon felt it before he heard it, a pressure in his teeth like the ache a man feels when a storm is coming. He climbed to the top of the wall at Eastwatch, wishing as he always did that there were more steps and less ladder. He came out into a world so clean white it hurt. The sea's skin had puckered and healed and puckered again. Far out, a shape wheeled. For an instant his stomach clenched just as he had known it would, as at the sight of a thing that was not yet lost and could be, and then he saw it was only a heavy gull with a long wind riding it. He exhaled and tasted frost. Below and to the north, a line of dead men arranged themselves with a care that had nothing to do with pride. They spread in a crescent. There were 4 of the tall ones. One lifted a hand. It was not a signal Jon could read. The men on the wall shifted their weight and then made themselves very still. He could feel the tremble that ran through them anyway, the way you can feel a horse tremble through the leather and would even when it stands and lowers its head and pretends it does not know the hounds are baying. Bran's raven did not come. Jon did not know whether to be grateful or bereft. Ghost leaned against his leg and watched with eyes as red as berries in snow. The dead did not care if they were watched. They did nothing at all. The wind went knife cold and then went away and left an emptiness in its place that was worse. When the first sound came, it was the crack of ice like a whip. Then the sea under the ice thudded. A long black line opened as if a mouth had decided to see if the world tasted different today. The dead did not move toward it. They waited. Men on the wall spoke to each other in chaff and mutter. Ed said something that should have been funny and made a man next to him close his eyes because he could not afford to laugh. The line closed. The dead continued to wait, and then, as if an order had gone out and come back, they began to pull back, the tall ones last. Jon did not call a cheer. The men below muttered and then went silent. He watched the hollow where they had been and the dark seam that had opened and closed and felt the way a blade feels when it is struck along its length by a hammer and sings. "They measure us," Ed said quietly, as a smith might say. "They draw it long grain." "Yes," Jon said. He wanted a horn to put to his lips and blow and make the world answer. He had no horn like that. He had ink. He had men with hands and feet. He had a brother who had learned how to look at the world as if it were a thing to be read and rewritten. Night came, more like an idea than a change because the day had never been light. Jon slept an hour and woke with the taste of ash and salt. He dreamed of a hall under the earth where roots hung like curtains and voices spoke in a language he had known once in a winter before his first winter. He dreamed of the shape of the north under a great white thumb pressing down. He dreamed of a dragon screaming and refused to let the dream run on to the place where it had to go to make sense. He woke and went out into the yard and found Bran in his chair, not asleep, not fully awake. "Do not let him take the dragon in the ice," Bran said, and his breath smoked and did not. "Do not let him call it a gift." "I will not," Jon said, and believed he would not simply because he said it. "You cannot stop everything," Bran said, and there was nothing unkind in it. "But there are places where one man's weight on the board changes the way the game looks to the other player. You are that weight. Do you see?" "I see enough," Jon said. "More than I wish to. Not as much as I need to." Bran's mouth bent into the echo of a smile, and then it was gone, and the boy closed his eyes and the wind riffled his hair and did not dare move it. By the fourth day, word came from the south that Sansa had emptied 6 villages in the Eastern Gift and sent 300 souls in carts and on foot and on shutters pulled by horses to White Harbor. The letter was in a smaller hand, Lyanna Mormont's, because the girl wrote quick and saved words as if they were steel. She said, "We are moving them. We will move more. Men complain that their fields will spoil and their cattle will die. I tell them their children will die if they speak to me of cattle again." She said, "We will need salt." She said, "I have trained girls to use spears tipped with glass. They shout when they practice and I make them stop. I tell them not to give away their fury for free." She said, "Send more glass." Jon read the letter and smiled a better smile than any he had found since snow began. He sent her more glass. He sent men who could make glass into things even girls could lift and drive quickly. The dead did not come in a rush. They came as winter does, which is to say they came and then waited and then came every hour in a slightly new way until men learned that their idea of rest was childish. The coastal ice grew stronger and more treacherous both. The sea under it kept its black hum. The ravens flew until they did not, and then they rested because birds do not carry duty the way men do. Jon let them because he had to learn to let any living thing rest when it could. He sent boys who had been born in places where the sea had always been a line at the edge of the world to listen to the sea until they could tell him when it was going to speak. On a day when the air was thin and made sound glassy and sharp, a lone figure shambled out from the north on the ice with its hands up the way men do when they are coming to a peace talk. It wore a black cloak and had a thing like a badge on its breast that had once been a knife. Its head hung forward as if it were a man ashamed. A fool shouted, "Parley!" and Ed smacked him in the chest and sent him to carry oil. Jon did not go down. He watched from above and set his bow in his own hands and not in another man's. He put the dragonglass arrow to the string and pulled. The figure came closer. His head lifted. It had no face worth speaking of. Its mouth opened and a sound came out that was not any sound a man has a right to hear. It was only halfway through the sound when Jon loosed. The arrow took the thing through the throat, not because he had aimed for the throat, but because once you pull a bow often enough it becomes an animal that wants to be fed the same way every time. The thing fell and thrashed, and the sounds it made were worse. It lay still. Then it got up and walked until a second arrow went into its eye. It lay still again, long enough for a man to wonder if it would teach him something by getting up twice. It did not. Jon felt only a small, mean victory about that, and the small, mean victory was enough to sleep on that night without dreaming. He sent more messages to more places and learned that there were only so many times you could write the same words and change the world by doing it. He wrote anyway. He told Sansa he would go to Dragonstone when the weather turned enough to let a man move on open water without being caught and nailed into it like a beetle in amber. He told Davos to go before him, because Davos knew ships the way men know their first loves. He told Tormund to pretend not to be bored when he was bored and to pretend not to be afraid when he was afraid. Tormund told him he had never pretended a day in his life and then pretended well enough that men laughed. The first time they took one of the tall ones down, it was by accident. A man who had not slept enough loosed a harpoon early. The heavy head punched through frozen air and into the tall one's chest, and it fell with the surprise of anything that has been convinced it will not fall. 10 whites near it broke like the bonds of a poor man, all at once. Men cheered. Jon did not stop them. It is good to know that things you think cannot break sometimes do. It is good to see that breaking. Some of the dead did not break. They bent and then bent back, and a man could think too much about what that might mean, but not today, not with men whose hands had to be kept warm with the work of cheering. That night, Bran's raven landed on the parapet where Jon's hand had made a smooth place in the stone with restless fingers over the days. "He is pulling at things under the sea," it said, and there was the sound of ice in the voice. "He is trying to make a mouth that will not shut." "What do I do?" Jon asked, and it was not low or steady. It was the question of a man at the mouth of a cave he has been told holds treasure and snakes both. "Do not give him teeth," Bran said. "Do not put anything into his mouth for him. It is a trick. He will offer you an ending that looks like mercy." Jon did not know what that meant. Not yet. He would. He always would. The world had a way of making sense after it had thrown you into the snow a few times and knocked the breath out of you. He reached to touch the raven and let his fingers brush feathers. The bird's head turned so its beak could nip him lightly. A brother's joke.
Jon's mouth bent.
Even that was warmth of a sort. The days stretched. The line held. Men died. Men lived in a way that made living mean something. In the night, when the wind's voice was higher and thinner and made the towers sing, Jon would go to the top and stand with Ghost and listen. He had taken to speaking aloud when he stood so that his voice would not get rusty, and because there are times a man does not need anyone to answer him. He said the names of the men who had died and did not spit after them as some do when they say a dead man's name in war so that bad luck cannot get in, because these men had died where they must and that ought to be enough armor for their names. He said Bran's name in Sansa's and Arya's like charms with sharp edges and soft middles. He said Samwell because he wanted to remember a man who had gone into a library thinking he could turn a library into a weapon and had been right. He said no other names more than once. On a morning when the snow had fallen thick and then stopped, and the light was flat and made the world seem like an old painting you could step into if you found the slit between frame and wall, a bell rang from the watchtower. 3 beats, 2-3. A code no one had heard in years. A ship in sight south-southeast. Men came out onto the parapets and into the yard and into the places between places with their mouths open like fish. Davos came up the steps 2 at a time at an age when men have sworn off stairs. He had a grin that was too big for his face and made him look like someone had sculpted him from driftwood and given only one color paint. "I told you they had a captain brave enough to chance it," he said. "I told you. The sea's a bitch and a mother both." "What flag?" Jon asked, though his voice had forgot itself and was laughing under its breath. Davos sobered without losing the light in him. "Black," he said. 3 heads. Red. Dragons. Jon's heart did what hearts do when they find they are instruments. It struck and made a sound that filled him with its own echo. He had thought of this in the way a man thinks of a wound he had before that aches when the weather turns. He had thought of a woman with storm in her and a name that had set fires before she was born. He had thought of fire itself. He had told himself he would not ask for rescue because the North should rescue itself if it can. He had told himself a lot of things that sounded clean and brave. Now the wind smelled like pitch and salt and something else, something older, and he felt very suddenly like a boy with a wooden sword standing in a place where iron rang. "They'll want harbor and a hand to tell them where to put their feet," Davos said. "And a king," he added dryly. "They'll get a man," Jon said, and a man was what he intended to give them. The day ahead would be long with parley and count and the sound of many kinds of pride rubbing against each other and making heat. He could feel in his bones that the sight Bran had shown him had pulled the future toward them like a rope, and now that rope had brought more boats. He turned to Ed. "Hold your line," he said, and Ed rolled his eyes without disrespect. "Go kiss your southern lady's hand," Ed said. "I'll hold the wall made of frozen piss and prayer." Jon put a hand to his friend's shoulder and squeezed. "The piss holds better than the prayer." "It always does," Ed said. Jon went down with Ghost at his heel and the winter in his lungs and the weight of the North on his shoulders. which fit him better now than it had when he first put it on. The sea ahead lay black under a skin of gray-white, and the ship that split that skin did it as neatly as a knife. He thought of Bran's voice telling him not to give the dead any endings they would enjoy, and of Sansa's finger drawing a line, and of the boys learning to string bowstrings with hands that had not forgotten how to hold spoons. He thought of men who had learned to fall back and stand again. He went to meet fire at the edge of ice, and he was not the boy he had been, and not the dead man he had been, and not the king men had decided he ought to be. He was the thing that happens when winter teaches a man to decide what he is every morning and then be that all day. He went, and the world looked different as he did, as if what he carried shifted its weight and asked him for a new balance. He found it. He would have to find it again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The wall to hold was not only ice. It was a line through him. That evening, when the day had been given up to the work of greeting and raising and taking the measure of fire and men from other seas, Jon stood in the hard blue shadow of the wall and watched the dead begin to crawl forward once more in lines that were not straight but good enough. Ghost's breath stood white in the air. The torches burned along the parapets and sent up thin red letters that were unreadable but said everything. He did not pray. He did not think of the gods. He did not think of what his father would do or what his mother would have said if he had had a mother of his own. He thought only of the thing Bran had told him. Do not give him teeth. He set himself to the work of denying someone else a mouth. He smiled once, small and hard, at the thought that even in winter there were jokes to be had, that a man could laugh at a thing that would otherwise swallow him. The sea under the ice thudded again, low and steady. The dead moved with the patience of old debt. The flames along the wall hissed and cracked. Far behind him in a hall that had been full of other voices an hour ago, men spoke in a language that had not been heard in the north for a very long time. The night had set its teeth in the world. The world did not cry out. It bit back. The captain had the sea in his beard and the cold in his knuckles. He came down the gangplank first with an easy balance born of decks that move under a man whether he wills it or not. Behind him, two men took a long chest between them, painted black and rimmed in iron, and behind them another pair bore its twin. The flag above them snapped hard, black field, three-headed dragon in red worked new into canvas that had not yet learned to sag. It struck Jon as a thing made yesterday and set to work today with no patience spared for grace. Davos went at his elbow like a man greeting a cousin he had not seen since they both stole eels in a White Harbor market. He spoke sailor to sailor. The sounds of it ran like rope through calloused hands. Shearwater out of Driftmark, he said into Jon's ear when the captain had bowed and given his name and the name of his wife and a child who would be born in a month if the winter did not change its mind. Valerian men, Lord Corlys' house, loyal to Dragonstone when it suits them, loyal to their keel the rest of the time. The captain offered a sealed roll of vellum. The wax bore the dragon impressed deep, and the paper smelled faintly of smoke and some perfume Jon could not name. He broke the seal and read with the wind running cold fingers under the parchment. To Jon Snow, called King in the north at Eastwatch by the sea, I have made my seat at Dragonstone, which my ancestors held when they came to this country and took it and made it what it is and what it is not. Your men have sent word of your need and of the danger that walks. I would be foolish to ignore it, and I am not foolish. I have no wish to be another king men curse when the counting is done. There is dragonglass under Dragonstone enough to arm an army. I offer it to you with the labor to get it out and the ships to carry it and the men to work it. I ask in return that we speak as sovereigns, you and I, and decide if we will be two fires that burn apart and leave the wind a free road between us, or one fire that throws a longer light. If you will come to me, you will be received as befits a king. If you cannot come because the night will not let you, I will send more of mine until the glass is in your people's hands. Daenerys of the House Targaryen, first of her name. The formal phrases bristled like the quills of a cold porcupine. Between them moved something extra, heat, pride, a will that had been sharpened on much use. Tyrion Lannister's small hand crept between the lines too, thin as a spider, weaving sense into grandeur. Jon felt it the way a farmer feels a hidden rock under plow. He read it twice and passed it to Davos. Davos's mouth pursed and unclenched. "A queen who remembers to offer tools with talk," he said. "Rare as a priest who can sharpen a knife." Jon looked at the chests. "What's in them?" "Gifts," the captain said, and he had pride enough to let it sound like gifts and not bribes. "And proof." They carried the chests into the hall with the cold smoking off them and opened them like coffers of some southern prince. The first gave up long, wrapped bundles of glimmering black, the color of night seen through water full of stars. The blades within were strange. Some were spearheads worked into elegant leaf forms with edges that took the light and broke it. Some were knives, ugly and honest. The second chest held molds in iron and in clay, arrowhead shapes and spear sockets and things whose use Jon could only guess at until a smith had them in hand and made them speak. On top lay 3 books, bound in old leather rubbed soft by hands long dead. One a treatise on fluxes and how to keep molten stone from behaving like a mule in spring. One a broken history of Valyrian work that mentioned dragonglass in the offhand way of an old lord who expects everyone at table to know the recipe for sauces, and one much more recent with a tidy hand and diagrams so clear even a tired man's mind could walk through them without tripping. Miner's braces and the art of holding the mountain's mouth open. "Sam," Jon said under his breath. He turned the pages and saw Sam in every line that kept arrogance out and put usefulness in. It was a good newer book, shy of flourish, rich in exactness. "Dragonstone sends you a smith?" the captain said, bowing as if to introduce a dancer. A man came forward who had a hammer's neck and the hands that go with it. His hair curled tight as shavings above a brow that had learned to lower before blows and jokes alike. "Gendry," he said, plain as bread. Jon had no cause to know the name, save as any man might. There are smiths, and there are men who make steel sing for them. But Davos made a small noise in his throat that was not surprise and not quite delight, and Jon tucked the name away and the sound beside it. He looked to Gendry and saw something in the way the man set his feet that said he did not care where he had been. He cared where he would set the next step. "You will show my men how to use those," Jon said, with a nod at the molds. "Aye," said Gendry, his mouth twisted. "And how not to? Others come behind us," the captain said. "If the ice lets them. Mules, coal, men who can cut and carry. Lord Tyrion has it in his head to turn Dragonstone upside down if need be. He says your men won't thank him if he leaves dragonglass under their feet when there are dead men walking on top of them." Jon felt and did not show the rush the words brought, the kind a starving man feels at the smell of stew, the current down the spine when a wolf leaps. He had expected this would be harder. He had prepared for it to be harder, so that he could not be broken by it being so. A thing coming easy was itself a kind of trap. He looked past the captain toward the sea. The black ice flexed its muscles and set itself. Beyond, the dead were a faded stippling along the white. They did not care that a ship had arrived. "We will pay in coin we have," Jon said. "In men, in whatever can go on a boat. I will send men who know ice to teach yours how to guess at where it will lie to you. Pay comes in many forms," the captain said, with the practical piety of his kind. "We'll take what won't drown us on the way back." That night, the Dragonglass Hall, as men began calling the old long vault under Eastwatch without bothering to wonder why it had never had a name before, took on a low hum. Gendry moved through it with a surety that made men twice his age step to do what his hands showed them rather than wait for words. "Not so hot," he said, steady as an anvil. "It runs like water then and makes fools of your molds. Keep that door open. Good air makes the difference between a blade and a puddle you'll be prying off your shoes at morning." Men who had never lifted more than a hoe felt the new weight of dragonglass picks in their palms and learned not to swing them like axes because the glass would punish you for thinking it was steel. "Tap, don't hack," Gendry said. "Let the mountain tell you where it will break, and then make it think that was its idea." He made a thing to stir the pots that was all rod and ring and pivot, and even Ed allowed that perhaps southern men were not entirely a waste if they came with toys. Jon watched until the heat made his eyelashes feel gummy and left with his hair smelling of smoke and something metallic that was not metal. Outside, the cold took him in both hands and reminded him what world he lived in. He walked the parapets, He did that each night without deciding it, the way a man with a lame leg learns to favor it before he knows he is doing it. Ghost went at his heel and sometimes ahead and sometimes far out where the light ran thin and the shadows had teeth. It was a plain night. The dead did not come on. Their points of light, the faint gleam of rime on a wrist, the thin sheen on a cheek, made a scatter across the white distance. He set the new glass in his mind against that scatter and told himself the scale could be changed. Not easily, not quickly, but changed. He imagined lines of men from Deepwood to the Dreadfort learning to set a spear point with the same calm a woman sets a spindle. Boys who had grown long too fast learning to drop a white with 2 arrows and not waste a third. He imagined Sansa looking at a ledger and not interrupting her own counting when a man argued beside her. He imagined Lyanna Mormont on a field one day, not today, not yet, standing with her spear in a long line and saying nothing because everything had been said already. In the God's Wood at Winterfell, a snowflake landed on Bran's cheek and melted without making him shiver. He was where he always was and where he never was. His eyes looked into places where the world wore a thinner skin. When he spoke, it was the voice of the raven again, and of the roots under the earth, and of a boy whose brother had carried him on his back through a door a giant had held. "Do not let her fly where the ice will remember her," he said. The raven set it on Jon's parapet, and a second bird took it and set it to a woman in a room of black stone and fire far to the south, and a third set it to no one at all in a night wood because the thing wanted saying. Jon woke before the words left the bird's beak because there are times a man's body hears before his ears do. He did not know the shape of the warning, only the flavor. He had told himself already that he would not ask for dragons to be flown north of the lakes. Not yet. He had told himself that a trap laid under a white sky is not for a creature that can simply leap the sky. The hearing set steel in that thought. He went down into the dragonglass hall and told Gendry to make more arrowheads. "More than you think a man can carry," he said, and Gendry said, and then, "I have thought about how to put 4 on a shaft." As if that were an ordinary thing a man might spend his night thinking on. A horn blew low at dawn. The dead advanced, not with fury, with aim. The oil lines did their work, and the new-made ladders with hooks bit where they should bite, and men tugged them free before any could be caught. A tall one came with a head cocked to one side as if listening to a tune only he could hear. Ed sent a harpoon into his collarbone and watched him stumble, and the men nearest shouted as if they had seen a man trip on his own feet at a feast. A shout can be warmth if you have first bled for it. Jon did not begrudge them. He did not look for the Night King's face. He had seen it often enough in his mind. He listened for a rhythm that was not theirs. He found none. They fed the fires and they fed the glass and they pulled men back who wanted to stay and die because staying feels like bravery when the ground is too cold to think. By full light, the dead had found another patience and settled at a distance that made men itch between the shoulders. They did not watch the wall. They watched the sea. Jon felt it in the way their bodies leaned. "He wants a mouth," Bran had said. Jon walked the length of Eastwatch with Davos and a white-haired fisherman from the Sheepshead Hills who had learned to read the sea by old habits and not theory. "We cut channels here and here," Jon said without pointing, "because men watch fingers and the dead may watch anything, and lead any break toward that arm of rock. If the ice goes down there, will it catch?" The fisherman squinted. "It will try not to," he said. "The sea hates to do one thing, but if you feed it this way." He made a small motion with his thumb, a coaxing. "You want to trap the water," Davos said. "Men forget. Water is an animal. It can be teased." They lashed together rafts from old timbers and laid brush over them, and under the brush laid empty casks, and under those, ice that had been persuaded to let go of the sea and come along docile for a while. Men hauled the lashings when the tide pulled wrong and let go when it pushed right. They worked with poles and hooks. They did not look like an army. They looked like men on a river working out how to get hay from one bank to another without getting it soaked. Gendry spat in his hands and pushed a pole until his shoulder spoke to him in a voice he would respect tomorrow. The dead let them. That was the worst of it. To be allowed to prepare is to be told that your work is being watched. To be told that it is amusing, that it will not matter in the end and so may as well keep you warm now. Lionel Mormont's third letter came up the King's Road in the glove of a giant. Or so the boy who carried it thought of the man beside him. It was only a Karstark who had grown wrongly and too fast, long in limb and narrow in chest. But boys make giants as they please. Lionel's hand was even smaller and sharper here. We have moved 12 steadings. The old mill was frozen to its axle. We cut it free. Men who told me a year ago they would not let their daughters learn to spear now send their sons to them and do not smile. Good. We need salt and candles and men who can count. We can make soap if we get fat. Give us fat. Tell your men if they abandon an old woman on the road to save a young one, I will have their ears for my necklace. She added, send the glass. Already the girls argue over the arrowheads. That made Jon laugh. A good short sound that left him warmer for a breath. Arya came to Winterfell as a lean gray shadow and stayed that way for a day and a night and a day, learning the hall's noises again as if they were an old dance, and she had to recall where to place her feet so as not to step on some fat lord's toes. She did not send a letter. Sansa sent one for her. It was simple, she is home. And then, because you count numbers, here are some. We have 387 aged over 60 but not beyond work. 112 between 40 and 60 who can do just as much more, they say. 190 boys and girls who can carry and cook and dig. There are 4 maesters and 1 woman who knows herbs better than any of them and cuts men when she must. The forges work at night and the men curse the black dust in their throats. Arya reads and says nothing. She watches the road with a look that frightens the fat ones. If she asks to ride north, tell me if I must tell her no. Jon wrote back, tell her I will tell her where the line is when I see it. For now she is the knife in your drawer that need not go outside. He did not like writing that. He liked the feeling it left behind even less. That he had put a wolf back in a house and told it not to scratch the door. Sam's 4th roll of paper arrived damp at the edges and furious in its lines. Said, your glass will blunt if cast into snow. Let it cool as a loaf on a board. They had a thing in Valyria like a kiln for bread that you set the pieces in and folded hot wool around. Wool. There were sheep then in places that are black now. Never mind. We cannot have that. But you can bury them in ash if you have wood to burn, and sprinkle them with water that ran through limestone. We do not have limestone. Do you have limestone? If you do, take a bit, drop it in a cup of vinegar. If it fizzles, it is limestone. That is a trick Gilly learned, and she taught me. Never underestimate what Gilly will learn if you leave her near anything that needs learning. He had drawn a little cup with bubbles rising. Jon showed the page to Gendry, who grunted. I know vinegar when I smell it, he said, and set a boy to steal jars from the cook with a rope around his waist to remind him to come back. A week slid past like a blade through fat, without hurry, without snag, leaving a smooth wake. The dead pressed here and there, testing, and were burned and fractured and pushed back. A boy lost his ear to frost and wept soundlessly while another boy held his hand. Men began to wear their socks on their hands and their mittens on their feet, because a man will try anything when he can no longer feel where his fingers end. Jon learned whose wives wrote angry letters and whose wrote careful ones and whose did not write at all because they could not write and had no daughters or sisters near with letters in their hands. He learned which men could be sent to the ice with a rope and which men needed to be kept on top of walls where their fear made them methodical and obedient. He learned the smell of a man whose boot had taken water and frozen his toes to a color like raw meat. He learned how to send that man back in time and how not to see him again. On a day when the frost fog hung at shoulder height and made men look like heads on pikes moving about their work, Tyrion Lannister came off a second ship carrying a cloak that would have looked absurd on any man less certain he had a right to be warm. He walked with a man's arrogance whose legs had been taught humility by stairs and rough ground. He had brought more chests and more books and more men. He had brought something else too. The look of a city in the eye, the memory of rooms where men become clever by telling themselves they are too wise for cold. He had not forgotten how to be kind where it would buy him what he wanted. He bowed to Jon as to a king and then smiled as if there were a second bow inside the first that only the two of them could see. Once I told you you would need allies, he said, and he managed not to put I told you so into it, though Jon heard the ghost of it. You told me you would need a king who does not think his crown will melt if a northern wind looks at it twice. How fortunate that we should both find ourselves here with the wind looking at us whatever we call ourselves. Fortunate, Jon said, and not coldly. Tyrion had the grace to look past him to the wall and then beyond to the white and the dead's dark freckles. For a heartbeat he forgot to be clever. His lips tightened. I've seen many armies, he said, quiet. This one is beyond any man's vanity. He looked back and let his words become business again, as men do when their hearts show and they do not like the color. My queen will not fly north of the long lake. I did not need to convince her. Someone else convinced her before my letter did. A boy with a raven's voice. That is an odd sentence even for me. She sends her hand mine to make sure this. He waved a hand to take in the noise. And smoke and men moving iron and glass does not fail for want of bread or numbers on a page. If you will not come south, we will go north in pieces that can float. Her dragons, Jon asked, and made no apology for the hunger in it. South of Long Lake, Tyrion said, on shores that are not ice. Even dragons have lungs. They have to breathe. It is an unromantic thought.
I am an unromantisch Mann.
You will thank me for that quality before we are done. He lifted a brow. If we are done. Jon did not argue. He had learned to let a good idea come to him with a name on it he did not like. He set Tyrion with Davos and the quartermasters, and in an hour half the men in Eastwatch had learned to hate small precise questions asked 100 times in a pleasant voice. In 2 hours, those same men had learned to be grateful for them, because the questions turned out to be doors you did not know you needed to open until you had walked through them and smelled the food behind. At dusk, Ed came up with a face that had the pinched look of a man who has realized his humor will not do the work he asks of it today. They're trying the rafts, he said. Not with their feet, with spears. They went to the lower parapet where the sea could be seen as a rush of shadow under fragile white. Out on the ice, the dead had taken the long poles from places where the watch kept them for fishing when the world had still had fish and were probing forward, tapping, testing, moving the rafts by inches and by accident both. They aren't clever, Ed said. That would be easier. They are patient. That is worse. Jon tasted iron. Light the far line, he said. Men ran and ropes went, and the line picked out went like a fuse along the base of the outer wall. The dead did not look up. They kept tapping. A raft slid an inch and then another, and the sea underneath made the sound Davos had named. The animal under the skin. The ice out beyond buckled and rose and settled like breath. A long creek ran through it like a word too old to say. Now, Jon said. They cut 2 ropes at once, and the rafts jerked, and the casks under them rolled, and water that had been waiting took the path it had been offered because sometimes even the sea likes to be told what to do. A black mouth opened 10 horse lengths out from the wall, neatly between 2 of the dead's cautious probes. The whine that came from the ice was so high men heard it with their teeth. The closest dead turned. They do not have faces to make expressions on, but the way they shifted looked like surprise. That pleased Jon in a mean small way and kept him warm for 1 breath and no more. They began to move their line not back but sideways, toward ground where the ice set its feet better. Again, Jon said, and again. When that held, and the 3rd time the sea refused to be led because nothing on earth likes to be a habit. He accepted that refusal and set men to change the arrangement as Davos had taught him. Never force one thing when 3 easier ones stand near. That night, Tyrion drank just enough to take the ache from his hands and stood next to Jon on the dark parapet as if they were 2 men at a play sharing a cheap bench. You are doing a thing they will write of, Tyrion said, and his voice held its old iron flake and something softer. Not because of glory, because it is the right size of work for a man's hands in a great age. That is rarer than glory. I am doing a thing to keep boys' feet from freezing, Jon said. If that makes a story, it will be because men like stories better than cold.
Ido.
Tyrion made a sound that might have been laughter and might have been something worn down to its copper. My queen will ask you to bend the knee, he said after a time, as if he were pointing out a reef in a channel. She will ask because it is her nature to ask for what is owed. If you do not, She will look at the world again and find a way to count you as friend anyway. It is my nature to say that out loud. It saves time. You save time because you think we have none, Jon said. I save time because the world wastes it, Tyrion said. And the world cannot afford to be the thing that spends the most and has least to show for it. Strange that I should be the one to say this here under a wall. But there it is. It is a new age. I have begun to like new ages. A snow began then, as if to prove that some things are always the same. It fell straight down, polite, without wind to carry it. The flakes were large, and a man could see his breath in them. Ghost lifted his muzzle and let his tongue catch one without effort. Tyrion held his hand out, palm up, and they melted in the lines there. A runner came, sliding on a patch of ice and catching himself at the last with a hand that knocked his knuckles bloody. Lord Snow, he said between huffs, forgetting titles twice. Your Grace, a rider with stark colors, from the south. He says the White Knife's mouth is clogged with broken ice and men are pulling it with ropes. He says the Manderleys sent a ship into the Bight anyway and lost her. Names, Jon said, because the dead make numbers, and men must answer with names. Gull and Gudgeon, the boy said. They got half her men. Half were taken in the ice. Wyman Manderley cut his own bread thinner that day for the women in the river village we sent down from the gift. He said to tell you he does not want thanks, he wants salt. And the glass. He will have both, Jon said. Send him the clean salt, Tyrion said in an aside that would have sounded like condescension in any other mouth. If you send the gray, the boys will get sores and rot. I learned this from a whore and a factor when I was 12 and thought it mattered only to women and men who count coins. It matters to everyone. It matters to everyone now, Jon said, and sent 2 mules worth south by sled that night rather than in the morning because men sleep better when they know that somewhere in the dark something is moving toward them with food on its back. The next day, a pale sun showed itself long enough to make the world look like tin for an hour and then went away as if embarrassed by what it had revealed. The dead drew back a little all along the line, a low tide of malice. Men on the wall dared to stretch without immediately hunching again. Ed said, "Don't believe it. When a girl stops shouting at you, it's either because she's thinking about her next shout or because her mother's watching." "Who taught you girls?" a boy said, and Ed sighed. "Life," he said. "It has not finished. I do not expect it to. That is its charm." In the Dragonglass Hall, the molds grew a crust of black sand. Gendry taught men to break the crust off with long blunt knives they called spoons because the word was old in their mouths and easy. He had a way with boys who were afraid of heat. He told them things that made them laugh without trying. He spoke of a king in a tavern and a boat on a river that went sour. He did not say the names, but Davos looked once with that particular grief men where when the past rises in the smoke and walks through the room. Mira Reed went south by sled. Bran had told her to go home and save what could be saved among the crannigs, which is to say the things that live under reeds. Children, songs, the taste of certain fish. She had argued only as long as a good friend argues before she bows to a truth that knows her. And then she had put both her hands on Bran's and pressed her mouth to them and gone. Jon stood with her in the yard as she put her foot on the sled and found it was a foreign thing to do, like stepping onto another life. "You saved him," Jon said, and Mira's mouth went stubborn then soft, then stubborn again. "He saved us," she said, and the sled slid and the rope went taut and she went away into a white so bright it made his eyes water. He told himself he would see her again. It is easy to be a liar with such promises. The world makes them for you. At dusk, men on the wall saw shapes standing out on the ice that were not like the dead that had come before. They were low and humped, and a man could mistake them for rocks if he wanted to believe in rocks where the sea has the say. They were whalebacks, beached under ice and half full of sea and half of air and miserable enough to make any man pity them, were men not keeping their pity for those who spoke to them. The dead gathered around the whales, not as men gather to marvel or to cut meat, but like flies around a wound. "They will make a gate of their bodies if we do not make a gate of ours," Davos said, dry. "Fire," Jon said. They sent it, and men who had never set whale flesh aflame before learned what it smells like. old oil, rancid and sweet. It burns slow and stubborn, and the smoke clings. The dead did not cough. They never cough. The men on the wall did, and learned quickly to wrap their mouths in cloth and smear grease on the cloth, so that the sun could come through if there had been sun, and the smoke would stay out whether there was or not. That night, as if the world were a patient who had listened closely while the careful, quieter doctors did what they could and then decided to call in a butcher, the tumult broke. The dead came on fast. The four tall ones moved like reeds in a high wind, bending and straightening with a grace that makes a man furious to see it, because he is reminded that not all things that can kill you are ugly. A great boar of ice and shadow charged a line where boys had been sent back and men stood whose anger did not heat them and therefore did them no good. It took three and then fell when a spear in Gendry's hand found whatever makes even such monsters part company with their purpose. The men who had fallen slid on their own blood sweet as slays. Jon put his own spear where he had seen Gendry put his and felt the way dragonglass goes into a thing like a letter into a slot meant for it. Not with a fight if you get the angle right, but with your heart. A tall one set its bright eye on Jon, and the space between them turned to a wire pulled very tight. The first arrow Jon loosed was wasted, and his hands knew it before the fletching left his fingers. The second went askew because everything you've practiced looks different when the thing in front of you hates you and must make your end its business. The third struck rib and glanced into a hollow that maybe had been lung once for a man who had wanted to breathe once upon a life so far lost it was nothing now. The thing went down the way a tower goes down when one stone on the second course of the fifth layer has cracked and nobody noticed because there are so many stones. 10, 15. More whites about it fell the way wheat falls when a woman who has done nothing but reap morning to night for 20 years steps into a field at last. Jon did not cheer. He did not want the sound. He wanted the quiet of breathing that was only breath and not the shudder in the chest that follows fear. Somewhere out on the ice, something walked that was not like them. Jon did not see it. He felt it the way marrow feels weather. The dead wavered, just a hair, and then steadied. "He is there," Bran would say later, in a voice like rime on glass. "He will always be there where we are, when he chooses." He had not chosen to come near enough for a dragonglass arrow. He had chosen to measure the men behind the wall and weigh them in a hand that did not tire. By dawn the wall held and Eastwatch stood, and the dead had drawn back, and a boy was dead with his eyes open, which made the men who shut them realize they had been blue and now were only eyes, and a man had lost 3 fingers to frost he had not felt taking them, and Ed had used up his humor and could not find any more in his pockets. "I will say something funny at noon," he promised anyone who looked despairing before then, and men nodded as if that were a promise a man could be expected to keep. A dragon came the next day, and Jon learned what it is to have the sky backhanded. The shadow passed over the yard, and every dog that had not run in the last week bolted and hid under anything it could find that looked like a table. Men who had no prayers said them anyway, because a dragon means old things, and men are mostly old things inside no matter how new their clothes are. It did not land. It did not even stoop. It came over low enough for Jon to feel the groan in the air its wings made and went north and then curled back south again and did not set its shadow down on the ice. The platform on its back held a shape that could only be a woman, very small at that height, with hair that flung the sun about like seed. It hovered south of Long Lake, then went away as if to say, "I am real, and I will be where we agreed, and clean air is not to be wasted." "Good," Jon said to the men whose mouths were still opening and closing, and they nodded as if he had given an order rather than named a fact. Tyrion said, "She is a lesson," and meant for men and for monsters both. They sent more carpenters south then, and masons and men with arms like the trunks of trees who could lift anything and will argue with anyone about the best way to get a load across a bad bridge because men like that keep the world from falling. They sent girls who had learned to set glass to ash. They sent one of the books and kept 2, because if a book sinks men will drown trying to reach it. They sent a letter with the book. "Do not fly north. Come to the White Knife's mouth if you must, or to Queen's Crown. We will build great fires there and set a field where the dead must come through a narrow place. If they come, we will try to anger them in another direction. Sam says your dragonfire on the belly of the sea makes a fog a man cannot see through. If we can make fog that the dead cannot see through, They cannot learn the paths as they like to do. He did not sign it with King. He signed it with his name. Men, Ed said when he had gathered those who could stand and those who could not in a cluster around the yard fire. Go home. It took a heartbeat for the words to make sense anywhere. Home, he repeated. If you have a home that is not this place, if you have a wife who scolds and a girl who stands at the door in a dress in a color you think ugly and a boy who picks his nose and expects praise for it, go. We have more men coming. We can afford to send some away for one night, too. Go and look at a thing that does not wear black and is not covered in frost. Go and remind yourselves that the world you keep is not all wall and dead and piss turning to icicles on the way down. Come back before dawn. Bring what you can steal. If you cannot steal anything, bring a story. A laugh ran around the fire, a low sudden warmth, and then men sobered again because even kindness is cold in winter when you measure it against the need. But some went. The rest stood straighter and found that their hands were hands and not lumps of meat on the ends of their arms. John did not know if Ed's order was wise in any ledger where wars are kept, but he thought it might save more men than it cost. Ed had been a steward once. Men forget that stewards keep the world by remembering the shape of men's hunger. They tried the fog 2 days later at the mouth of a small gutted river that found the sea like a man finds his knees in the dark. Tyrion had read Sam's hand 3 times and argued with Davos twice over the proper way to lay oil and set fires to make smoke thick and slow. You don't layer smoke, Davos had said, half laughing. You coax it. Treat it like a child who has to be led to the door and told when to put his shoes on his feet and not on his hands. Tyrion had thrown up his small hands and said, I have never been patient with children. This is why I am good with books. They laid their fire on wet brush and the bellies of dead whales and driftwood so old it seemed carved and fed it with oil so slowly it was insulted into remaining smolder rather than flame. The day was a still one. Old air, tired of moving. The smoke rose, made itself lively, and then decided to go nowhere. Pooled along the ice and seeped. Men on the wall could not see the first line out where the dead liked to set their first feet. John did not like that. He liked even less the way the dead kept advancing into it as if walking into a story they had not read. But when they came out again on the near side of the fog, they were where the channels had been cut, not where the lines had been set, and the mouth of the sea took 3 and then 10 and then 30 at once. The sound their bodies made, that dull succumbing, was the sound of a good plan closing its fingers. Men cheered. John held his breath and listened beyond it. The tall ones were moving. They were irritated. That was a thing. That was a thing a man could work with. Again, he said to Davos, and Davos said, Aye. And the smell was worse, and the fog sank closer, and the world for a while was all white and black and gray, and the hiss and pop of water that had been cold a very long time meeting fire that had not. He sent a raven to Bran to say, Fog works. He did not add, I am afraid it will work only once. He did not have to add it. Bran had said the same thing to himself an hour before the raven left the rookery, and the trees in the gods' wood had shifted their white shoulders as if shrugging as one. The counting never stopped. It is one of the winter's cruelties, that there are always so many numbers hanging in the air for any man who dares reach up and bring one down. How many arrowheads, how many hands, how many mouths, how many nights of oil if the wind sits steady out of the north and holds its lazy breath. John wrote smaller to fit more of the tally on a page and found his letters growing like the drawings a boy makes with a stick when he is told to write and would rather make wolves. Sansa sent pages ruled with neat lines and numbers that sat prim and self-respecting in their boxes. She sent a note that said, Arya has taken 20 girls into the yard and taught them to move in a way that makes old men decent. She has also taken 3 men by the ear. If you asked me for names, I would not give them to you. She added, I am sending you boots made from the hides of old cows that should have been eaten sooner. They are ugly. They are warm. They cost us sets of hands bleeding, and blood freezes. Do not waste them. He did not waste them. He sent 2 pairs to men who would never have asked for anything and 1 to Ed, who looked at them as if they were the best joke any god had told in a year, and then pulled them on and stood up and made a noise like a man returning to his mother's kitchen after long absence. On a day when the wind went south and seemed briefly like a visiting relative with a bag of sweetmeats tucked in its cloak, A black line of masts showed on the horizon, not close, far, like stitches on the skin of the world. They turned west long before they might have reached the place where ice would catch their keels. They were bigger than any ship that had come to Eastwatch. Men counted and lost count, then counted again and swore. It was the Dragonstone fleet, or enough of it that any quarrels about words would be eaten by the sight of that much timber and sail under a winter sky. Jon felt the impulse to summon Ed and Davos and Tyrion and draw plans as if a man can trap his own future by giving it a name and a map. He did none of that at once. He stood with Ghost and counted again, in case there was a different number in the look a second time. There was not. He took a breath and let it out and then went to work. They made a place at Queen's Crown where once a lake had been only a place for trout and now would be a gate. They mped a landing out of frozen mud and built racks for barrels and put old stakes in the soft ground where men would trip if not told twice where to put their feet. They sent men with poles out to test every place under the snow they could find where ice lay treacherous over running water. Arya came north 2 days and was sent back with a look like a knife that has been told it must be a spoon for a week and then maybe a knife again, and Jon pretended not to see it and she pretended to obey because pretending can be a sister's gift. They moved glass and they moved oil, and they moved whatever pride could be spared in bundles tied with rope. The dead came once and were beaten back and did not learn anything new that day. That frightened Jon more than if they had learned. Their patience was a hole a man could fall into without ever hitting bottom. He went to the gods' wood where no gods had spoken to him in words he could put his mouth around, and he stood and let his breath smoke with the trees, and Bran said, not with his mouth, "He wants your dragon. He will make a shape that looks like mercy. He will offer you your men alive, your line unbroken, your sister whole and your wife with a child under her heart for all time to come, if only you let him have the ending he loves." What if the ending we love more is life? Jon asked, and it sounded childish, and he did not care. He had no wife and no child and no line but the one his foot drew in the snow as he walked from one wall to another and back. He spoke it anyway so that the gods could hear him, so that the boy under the tree and the boy in him could hear him. Then the dragons came to the white knife's mouth like summer storms remembered wrong by old men, too big in the telling and bigger in the seeing. They did not hover. They landed on a ridge of rock black as the inside of the hearth, and their bodies steamed in the cold like water poured onto a griddle. Men stood very far away and looked very small and still. Daenerys Targaryen stepped down in wool and fur and leather that had been cut by someone who knew not to waste beauty on the cold and then cut it anyway. Her hair was braided in a crown that mocked crowns. There was nothing mocking in her face. She and Jon stood with a stretch of brown frozen rushes between them as if that strip of winter were a witness. Tyrion stood at her shoulder and Davos at Jon's and Missandei and Grey Worm and 2 of the Queen's Dothraki to show that even the summer has come north and put something more than songs at stake. The air made every word look like smoke. "You sent me fog," she said without preamble or courtesy that was not practical. "You made him blind for an hour. He hates that." "I intend to make him hate many things," Jon said. "I intend to find out how many hours there are in his patience." Her mouth bent in something almost like joy, quick and shocked, the way a woman looks when a child she believed dead coughs. Then she put it away. "You will not ask me to fly," she said, and it was statement, not question. "No," Jon said, "not where ice remembers and breathes. Not where he can find a reflection to set his hooks in. Stay south of the lake. Burn the paths in the woods we need burned. Drive deer out where men will be. Scorch the snow where we lay our fog so it rises quicker and lasts longer. If you set fire on the north side of a little ridge just before sunset on a wind from the west, it lies down along the ground. Then the dead find the place they don't know they hate until it is too late. I learned this from a man who burns seaweed." Tyrion made a pleased noise. Daenerys gave him the briefest flick of a look and then returned to Jon. "You ask a queen to be a torchlighter," she said. There was no sting in it. There was an invitation. "I ask a woman with dragons to be the thing only a woman with dragons can be in the north," Jon said. "I ask you to be the wind when it needs to blow and the wall when it needs to stand. If I ask you to be a knife, it is because there is a neck. If I ask you to be a pot, it is because there is soup." Davos coughed into his glove to hide a smile that was not entirely respectful. Tyrion exhaled like a man who had expected harder ground and found sand instead. Double-edged, easier and treacherous both. "I will not ask you to bend," Daenerys said. The words fell strange from her lips, as if they had been tempered with a rod that hurt the smith's hands. "Not now, not here. I will ask you to stand on my left when I light the line that burns the white knife of its ice at its mouth. I will ask you to send me men who can count. I will ask you to send me a wolf to watch my tents at night. Not because I think it will keep my enemies away. Because I think it will keep me honest. I will send you a wolf without asking him," Jon said, and Ghost, who had been lying in snow with a patience that had nothing of men in it, lifted his head and regarded the queen with the look of a red ember that will not go out if you blow too hard. "Good," Daenerys said. She did not put out her hand. He was glad she did not. Hands are for oaths, and men are fools with oaths in winter. He bowed slightly, and she bowed less, and men around them exhaled as if a knot had released in their chests. The dragons on the ridge shifted and set the ice to cracking without meaning to. After, when the queen had gone back down to the shore where ships waited like tame sharks and the dragons had gone with her walking because even a dragon is not always a thing that flies, Jon stood with Tyrion and they watched the line of the white knife, black where the flow had torn fresh ice and white where it had made an old scar new. "When the wall holds," Tyrion said, "it will not be because gods meant it to. It will be because men did." He tilted his head. "And women, and wolves, and one girl who looks at her sister like a sword at a shield. I do not know that I trust gods with such things. I do know that I trust them more than I trust bankers." "You trust very little," Jon said. "I trust loss," Tyrion said. "It teaches. Then we must learn. It is the only bargain we are usually offered. Your brother says he will try to offer us a different one." "My brother says many things," Jon said. "He says the Night King loves endings. I mean to make him live with middles until he chokes." They went north again. The dead obliged. They came in a ragged line and then in ranks, then broke and tried to swarm across places where the fog lay thin and were taken into the mouths the men had made for the sea to open. The tall ones sent a cold that made iron creak and the hair inside men's noses turn to needles, and Daenerys sent a heat that made men's breath smell like scorched wool. She did not set foot where Jon had warned her not to. She turned where he waved a flag on a pole like any sergeant. She burned the edge of a wood and the dead that had been climbing through it to hop down into a hollow like children from a wall. The wood stood and then lay down in embers with ascensions trees where when they have had long to learn the way of men's fire. The fog went up from those embers, and the dead turned their heads as dogs do at a whistle too high to hear. Jon did not think he had ever loved a day so full of killing. Love is not always for gentle things. He loved it the way a man loves the feeling in his hands after he has done hard work that saved his neighbor and broke no one's back. At night he slept and did not dream of dead dragons, and in the morning he woke with ice in his hair and laughed out loud, and men who had not slept at all laughed because laughter is a drink. "Don't give him teeth," Bran had said. Jon held his promise by inches. He gave him fog. He gave him broken ice, casks, rafts, ropes. He gave him men moving backward at a pace that made the tall ones snarl in that soundless way of theirs and then turn and find nothing to strike because nothing had stood where something had been a moment before. He did not give him dragonbone, nor dragonfire caught in the wrong mirror, nor a story that ends at a mouth of ice with a scream turned to a song. He wrote to Sansa, "We are not winning. We are not losing either. We are teaching the dead how much time it costs to learn a living man's stubbornness. We will have to pay for it later." He signed Jon. He added, "Keep the girls quiet when they train. Tell Arya the dead like the sound of men's pride as much as any song." He did not add, "I will die if you do not eat enough." He did not have to. Sansa's reply came quick and tight. "They eat. We save honey for the old. The girls knit. The boys carry slop." Arya scowls. I tell her it is a scowl for later. We count. We have begun to bury our dead inside the walls because the ground is iron and the wolves have better work. Do what you must. Do not be a song. The winter made new rooms in Jon he had not known were there. Some were cold and did not care. Some were warm and hurt. He moved through them with a steadiness that was not heroism and not saintliness and not anything a song would waste words on. It was the steadiness you find in a man at a bench with a boot he means to fix before his child goes out into snow. It is a kind of love. It makes things. It is the opposite of endings. The Night King came close enough once for Jon to see the starburst of his eyes without pretending. He stood on the ice and tilted his head at the fog as if admiring a piece of work someone else had made and he meant to use. He lifted one hand and for a moment the fog trembled and almost lifted its own will. Bran's voice said, "No." It did not. The hand lowered. The line of dead moved in a way that looked like a shrug. Jon looked into that blue and thought, bare and unlovely. I hate you in a way that is not simple. I hate what you do to the living. I hate that you make me a man who must count. I hate your endings. I will not give you mine. Then he turned away because hate is a waste of the time a man can spend making a new line of oil or fitting a new mold or cutting a hole where the sea will remember the road you want it to take. He put his hand on Ghost's head, and the wolf pressed up into it, and the world made a new room then too, one with a bench and a hand on a living thing and breath that clouded and did not. The dragons burned and did not freeze. Queen's crown smoked and sent its stink up to a sky that did not mind. Tyrion's numbers multiplied and subtracted until even he grunted. Davos stole vinegar enough to make all the northern cooks curse him by name and then forgive him when the arrowheads did not crack in the snow and men did not cut their hands going to ground for them. It found another jest. It was not a good one. Men laughed as if it were. When sleep came, it did not bring the black sea or a dragon's eye or a wight at a gate. It brought the smell of stew and the look on a girl's face when she learns the stringing of a bow and finds it in her hands forever after. It brought Sam's hand ink-stained and fat and happy because he had made one small thing easier for someone he loved and 1,000 he would never see. It brought Mira Reed standing in a marsh under a sky full of geese, holding a spear and smiling because the spear fit her hand. It brought Sansa with her head bent, counting, always counting, as if numbers were prayers that could be said until they set a skin on the world to keep it from shattering. He woke and the world had not shattered. It would try to. It would keep trying as long as there were mornings. He put his feet to the cold floor and stood and went out into the blue that is not light and not dark, and the line through him held as if it had been set in an older ice than any the world could make. He went to work. He would not give endings. He would give middles until even winter would be embarrassed to ask for more.